Some scars tell stories that tongues refuse to speak. And some men recognize warfare when they see it written on a woman's skin. The ballroom glittered with the kind of wealth that made ordinary people uncomfortable. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors, while soft classical music drifted through the air like expensive perfume. Wealthy guests in designer gowns and tuxedos moved through the space with practiced elegance, champagne flutes clinking in a symphony of privilege. Naledi Kumalo stood near the edge of the ballroom, her deep emerald evening gown hugging curves that drew appreciative glances from across the room. At late 20s, she was breathtaking, and the only black woman in a sea of pale faces. She moved with the grace of someone who'd learned to make herself invisible, but her Johannesburg-bred confidence kept her spine straight even as her eyes darted nervously across the crowd. She hadn't come to Seoul to fall in love. She'd come to disappear. A surgeon from South Africa with hands that saved lives and a past that had nearly taken hers. The red carpet beneath her feet was plush and thick, but her stiletto caught on its edge anyway. Time seemed to slow as she stumbled forward, her arms windmilling for balance. The sound of tearing silk cut through Mozart's Symphony No. 40 like a knife through flesh. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a virus spreading. Is she bleeding? What is that on her back? A guest whispered in Korean, not bothering to lower her voice. Another let out a cruel laugh. Probably couldn't afford a dress that actually fit. The tear ran from the back seam of her gown all the way down to her lower back, revealing far more than fabric. A constellation of scars ran from her shoulder blade down her spine, keloid tissue, burn marks, the unmistakable signature of torture. The ballroom fell into that special kind of silence reserved for public humiliation, the kind that makes skin burn and hearts race. Naledi felt the weight of every eye on her exposed back. Her hands trembled as she reached behind herself, trying futilely to hold the fabric together. Heat rushed to her face, and for a moment, she considered running, just fleeing the ballroom and never looking back. And then he saw it. The music seemed to stop, though the orchestra continued playing. A path cleared through the crowd as if by divine intervention, and Shin Jae-won stepped forward from the VIP section. He was devastating in a midnight black Tom Ford tuxedo, his face carved from marble, beautiful, cold, and utterly untouchable. Early 30s, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step back. The crowd parted for him the way prey moves for an apex predator, bodies shifting without conscious thought. Shin Jae-won. The ghost of Gangnam. A man who controlled half of Seoul's underground empire from boardrooms that smelled like expensive cologne and old blood. They said he'd never loved anything. They said he couldn't. He walked straight toward Naledi, each step deliberate and measured. Security personnel didn't dare stop him. Politicians lowered their eyes. Business moguls suddenly found their champagne fascinating. He stopped directly in front of her, and then, impossibly, inexplicably, he dropped to one knee. "Amanzi Almile," he said softly, speaking in Zulu with perfect accent and inflection. "Those are Zulu torture scars. Electrical burns. You were held for at least 3 months." Naledi's knees almost buckled. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared down at this stranger who'd just identified her deepest trauma with the clinical precision of someone who'd seen such things before. He stood with fluid grace, his movements controlled and purposeful. Without breaking eye contact, he removed his custom jacket, a piece worth more than most people's cars, and draped it around her shoulders with the reverence usually reserved for handling sacred cloth. The jacket was warm from his body heat and smelled of sandalwood and something darker, more dangerous. "Clear the east wing. Now," he said to the room, his voice dropping to lethal silk. "And if I see one photo of this woman on social media..." He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. The crowd scattered like frightened birds, guests suddenly remembering pressing engagements elsewhere. Within moments, the ballroom had emptied by half, the exodus so swift it seemed choreographed. Jae-won offered his arm with old-world courtesy. Naledi, too stunned to refuse, placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. His arm was solid beneath the fabric of his shirt, corded with muscle that didn't come from a gym. "How did you? Who are you?" she whispered, her Kosa-accented English barely audible over the resumed chatter of the remaining guests. Someone who recognizes a survivor, Jae-won replied, his dark eyes never leaving hers. Come with me. We need to talk about why someone sent you here tonight, and who wants you dead. The color drained from Naledi's face like water from a sink. Before we continue, if you love dark romance with twists that'll make your heart stop, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what happens next? You won't believe it. Now let's rewind to 3 hours before everything changed. 3 hours earlier, Naledi had stood in her small apartment in Itaewon, staring at an invitation that had arrived with no return address. The cardstock was thick and expensive, the lettering gold-embossed and elegant, Dr. Naledi Kumalo. You are cordially invited to the Hanseong Medical Foundation Annual Gala. Lotte Hotel Seoul, 7 p.m. Black tie required. She'd stared at it for 20 minutes, her surgeon's hands, normally steady as stone, trembling slightly. She'd been in Seoul for 8 months. 8 months of keeping her head down at Asen Medical Center, where her skills as a trauma surgeon were respected but her presence was merely tolerated. 8 months of speaking only when spoken to, of making herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. 8 months of perfecting the art of invisibility. 8 months of running from Johannesburg. From him. Her phone had buzzed with a text from her colleague, Dr. Park Min-ji, you got the invite too? This is huge. The Hanseong Foundation basically runs medical policy in Korea. You have to come. I'll help you find a dress. Naledi's finger had hovered over the delete button. She should decline. Should stay invisible. That was the plan, after all, blend in, do her work, and never, ever draw attention to herself. But something about the invitation nagged at her like a persistent itch. The Hanseong Foundation. She'd heard whispers in the hospital corridors, that it was a front for something darker. That its philanthropic donations came from laundered money. That its board members had connections to the Sangpamun, Seoul's most powerful organized crime syndicate. Every instinct told her to stay away. Which was exactly why she'd decided to go. By 7:45 p.m., Naledi had found herself standing in the Lotte ballroom wearing the emerald dress Min-ji had insisted on. It was a stunning floor-length gown with an open back, too open for Naledi's comfort, but Min-ji had been adamant. You're gorgeous, Naledi. Stop hiding. If only she knew why Naledi needed to hide. The ballroom had been obscene in its opulence. Ice sculptures shaped like phoenixes stood sentinel at each corner. Champagne that cost more per bottle than Naledi's monthly rent flowed freely. Seoul's elite moved through the space like beautiful sharks, all polished surfaces and hidden teeth. Naledi had accepted a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking and tried to blend into the wall, becoming part of the elegant wallpaper. Dr. Kumalo, a voice had called out. She'd turned to find a man in his 50s approaching, silver-haired with a smile too wide to be genuine. I'm Director Cho. Hanseong Foundation board member. We're so pleased you could attend. His eyes had crawled down her body in a way that made her skin prickle. We don't get many exotic additions to our medical community. Naledi's smile hadn't reached her eyes. How progressive of you to notice. His expression had flickered with something dark before he could respond. Fortunately, the lights dimmed, saving them both from further awkwardness. A woman had taken the stage, 60s, elegant, wearing enough diamonds to buy a small country. The announcer's voice had rung out, distinguished guests, please welcome Madam Shin Jae-won, founder of the Hanseong Medical Foundation. Polite applause had rippled through the crowd. Naledi had clapped automatically, her mind elsewhere, already planning her exit strategy. Until Madam Shin began speaking. Tonight, we celebrate not just medical excellence, but family. The foundation my late husband built was always meant to honor our son's legacy. Though Jae-won chose a different path. Her voice had tightened almost imperceptibly, a hairline fracture in her composed facade. We continue the work of healing. Something cold had slithered down Naledi's spine like ice water. Jae-won. Shin Jae-won. She'd heard that name before. Where had she? The memory had hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. 6 months ago. A late-night trauma surgery. A man brought into the emergency bay with 3 bullet wounds, no ID, cash payment only. His people had worn expensive suits that didn't match the blood-soaked scene and had refused to leave his side. She'd saved his life, never seeing his face clearly through the surgical mask and her laser focus on keeping him alive. But she'd heard his men in the hallway, their voices tight with fear. If Shin Jae-won dies, we all die. Her champagne glass had nearly slipped from her fingers. Before she could process the implications, the crowd had shifted, creating a natural current toward the terrace. Naledi had moved with it, needing air, needing space to think. Her heel had caught. The dress had torn. And her carefully hidden past had been exposed for everyone to see. Now, in the present moment, Naledi sat on a velvet sofa in a private suite in the hotel's east wing. Jae-won's jacket still draped around her shoulders, smelling of sandalwood and danger. Her mind raced as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, speaking rapid Korean into his phone. His tone was clipped, authoritative, a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. When he ended the call, he turned to face her with an expression of calm certainty. You operated on me 6 months ago. Asen Medical Center, 2 a.m., Emergency Trauma Bay 3. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Naledi met his eyes, which were dark, unreadable, and far too intelligent for her comfort. Patient confidentiality prevents me from. I had 3 bullets in my chest. You removed them in 47 minutes. Your hands didn't shake once, even when my second-in-command put a gun on the surgical tray and told you I couldn't die. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. You told him if he wanted to threaten someone, he should try someone who hadn't grown up in Hillbrow. Despite everything, the torn dress, the exposed scars, the surreal situation, Naledi's lips twitched with the ghost of a smile. She had said that, delivered in her flattest, most unimpressed tone while elbow-deep in his chest cavity. You saved my life, Jae-won continued, his voice dropping to something softer, more intimate. And then you disappeared. Refused payment. Refused to file proper reports. Why? Because I recognized the situation. I've seen it before. Naledi stood, his jacket falling to her elbows. You're gangster royalty, Mr. Shin. I'm a foreign doctor trying to keep her visa current. Our worlds don't mix. And yet here you are. At my mother's gala. Wearing a dress that was designed to show your scars. He tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle he was determined to solve. Who gave you that invitation, Dr. Kumalo? The question landed like a physical blow. I assumed it was from the hospital administration. I'm a senior trauma surgeon, it made sense. You've been in Korea for 8 months. You're brilliant, yes, but you're not senior staff. You shouldn't have been on the guest list. He pulled out his phone with practiced ease, pulling up a document and turning the screen toward her. Your name isn't on here. The room tilted on its axis. Naledi gripped the back of the sofa for support. Someone, Jae-won said softly, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge, wanted you here tonight. In a dress that would reveal your scars. In front of Seoul's elite and... He paused meaningfully. In front of me. The question is why. Before Naledi could formulate an answer, the suite door burst open with enough force to make her jump. The man who entered moved like violence waiting to happen, late 20s, wearing a designer suit that couldn't quite civilize the dangerous energy he radiated. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a perpetually aggressive expression. Hyung, he said in Korean, the word sharp with urgency. We have a problem. Jae-won's expression didn't change, but Naledi felt the temperature in the room plummet. English, Taemin. We have a guest. Taemin's eyes flicked to Naledi, dismissed her as irrelevant, then snapped back with sudden, sharp recognition. His entire demeanor changed. Her. She's the problem. He pulled out a tablet, fingers swiping across the screen before turning it toward them. The screen displayed a photograph that made Naledi's blood turn to ice in her veins. It showed her younger, thinner, haunted, standing next to a white man in military fatigues. Behind them, the Johannesburg skyline stretched across the horizon like a threat. "That's Colonel Andre van der Merwe," Taemin said, his voice hard. "Former South African Defense Force. Currently one of the most wanted arms dealers in Africa." He swiped to another photo. Naledi in surgical scrubs, in what was unmistakably a field hospital, her face exhausted and hollow. "And this is you, doctor, working in his private medical facility 3 years ago." "I was kidnapped," Naledi said, her voice hollow and distant, as if coming from underwater. "Taken from Johannesburg General Hospital because van der Merwe needed a trauma surgeon for his operations. I was held for 14 months. Her hand moved unconsciously to her shoulder blade, where the worst of the scars lay hidden beneath Jae-won's jacket. "When I tried to escape the first time, he made sure I understood the cost." Jae-won's jaw tightened, the only visible sign of emotion on his otherwise impassive face. "Go on," he said quietly, but there was steel beneath the softness. "I finally got out. Made it to the Cape Town embassy with nothing but the clothes on my back and more trauma than any person should carry. They helped me relocate, gave me a new start, a new chance at life. I chose Seoul because it was far enough away that he'd never." She stopped, realization dawning with the force of a physical blow. "He found me. That's why I'm here tonight. He wanted you to see those photos." "Not me," Jae-won corrected, his mind already several steps ahead. "My mother. The Hanseong Foundation has been negotiating a medical supply contract with the South African government. A very lucrative one worth billions in one." His eyes narrowed dangerously. Van der Merwe must have lost the bid. This is retaliation, discrediting the foundation by connecting it to someone linked to him. Killing 2 birds with 1 stone. But I wasn't linked to him willingly. Doesn't matter. In this world, perception is reality. Jae-won took the tablet from Taemin, his fingers swiping through the damning images. "When does this go public?" "It already has. Posted to 3 major news sites 7 minutes ago." Taemin's expression was grim. "The headlines are brutal. Hanseong Foundation hosts war criminals accomplice. Seoul Hospital employs torture surgeon. It's spreading across social media like wildfire." Naledi's knees gave out. She sank back onto the sofa, the fight draining out of her like water through a sieve. "I should leave. Get ahead of this. Issue a statement, pack my things." "If you run, you look guilty," Jae-won interrupted, his voice cutting through her spiraling panic. She could see him thinking, his mind working through scenarios like a chess grandmaster planning moves 3 games ahead. "Van der Merwe wanted to ruin you and hurt my mother's foundation. 2 birds, 1 stone. So what do we do?" Taemin asked, looking to his leader. Jae-won looked at Naledi, really looked at her, seeing past the terror and shame to something else beneath. She watched something shift in his expression, saw the moment a decision was made and lines were crossed that could never be uncrossed. "We call his bluff," Jae-won said with quiet finality. "We go back to the Gala. Together." "Are you insane?" Naledi stood on shaky legs. "I'm a liability to you, to your mother, to everything you've built. You're a survivor who was tortured for trying to escape a war criminal. That's not liability. That's..." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "That's someone worth protecting." "Why?" The word came out broken, desperate. "Why would you protect me? You don't even know me." "Because 6 months ago, when you could have let me die on that table, when it would have been easier to let me die and avoid all the complications that came with saving a criminal's life, you fought for 3 hours to keep my heart beating. Because you told my man to go to hell when he threatened you. Because..." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face as if afraid she might shatter at his touch, then dropped it back to his side. Because I know what those scars mean. My father had scars like that. He was held by a rival gang for 2 years before I was born. Tortured daily. Broken repeatedly. But he survived. He built an empire from the ashes of his trauma. And then he taught me something I've never forgotten: the most dangerous people aren't the ones who've never been broken. His voice went soft, deadly. It's the ones who broke and reassembled themselves stronger than before. Naledi's breath caught in her throat, tears burning behind her eyes. So here's what's going to happen, Jae-won continued with the quiet authority of someone used to orchestrating impossible outcomes. You're going to walk back into that ballroom with me. We're going to make a statement that you were a victim, a hero who saved lives under impossible circumstances, and anyone who says otherwise answers to me personally. And then... Wait, it gets insane. But first, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you Team Naledi or do you think she should run? Let us know. Now back to the story. The ballroom had transformed into a feeding frenzy in their absence. Naledi could hear the chaos before she saw it: journalists with cameras pushing against security, guests clustered around phones with expressions ranging from shock to malicious glee, the whispered poison of scandal spreading like contagion through the crowd. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear into the Seoul night and never look back. Instead, Jae-won took her hand. His skin was warm, his grip unbreakable but not painful, the hold of someone offering an anchor in a storm. Breathe, he murmured, his mouth close to her ear. Let them look. Let them see who you are, not what was done to you. The doors opened. The room fell into immediate, heavy silence as every head turned toward them like sunflowers following the sun. Naledi walked in beside Shin Jae-won, the ghost of Gangnam, the man who'd never been photographed with a woman publicly, the untouchable prince of Seoul's underworld who was now choosing her, publicly and deliberately. His mother, Madame Shin, stood frozen on the dais, her face a careful mask that couldn't quite hide her shock. Jae-won led Naledi straight to the center of the room with the confidence of a man who owned every space he entered. Then he turned, addressing the crowd in Korean, his voice carrying across the vast space without him needing to raise it. Taemin materialized beside Naledi like a shadow, translating in low tones so she could understand every word. Many of you have seen the news tonight. Stories about Dr. Kumalo. Photographs. Accusations. Let me clarify something. His voice carried like thunder, commanding absolute attention. This woman standing beside me is one of the finest trauma surgeons in Seoul. She was kidnapped by Andre van der Merwe, a man currently wanted by Interpol for war crimes, arms trafficking, and human rights violations spanning 3 continents. She was held against her will for 14 months. Tortured when she refused to compromise her medical ethics. And she escaped. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through grass. She came to Korea to rebuild her life. To use her extraordinary skills to save others, to give back to a world that had taken so much from her. 6 months ago, she saved mine. He looked directly at his mother, and Naledi saw an entire conversation pass between them in a single glance: challenge, understanding, acceptance. Van der Merwe targeted her tonight to hurt the Hanseong Foundation's international reputation. He wanted to weaponize her trauma, to turn her survival into a scandal. Jae-won turned back to the crowd, his expression hardening. But here's what he didn't count on. The Shin family doesn't abandon allies. We don't let predators win. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Naledi's heart stopped beating. Dr. Naledi Kumalo, he said, switching to English, his accent wrapping around her name like silk and smoke. I'm not a good man. I've done things that would horrify you. I live in a world you spent 14 months trying to escape, a world of violence and moral compromise. He opened the box. A diamond ring caught the light, Art Deco, vintage, breathtaking in its complex beauty. The kind of ring that told stories. But I'm a man who pays his debts. You gave me my life back when you had every reason to let it end. Let me give you your freedom. He took her hand, and this time, he did drop to one knee, the ghost of Gangnam kneeling before a woman in a torn dress in front of Seoul's elite. Marry me. Not for love, not yet. But for protection. For strategy. For the only thing that will make van der Merwe back down and never touch you again. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made the rest of the room disappear. Become a Shin. Untouchable. Unreachable. Free. The ballroom held its collective breath, hundreds of people frozen in a moment that would be talked about for years. Naledi looked down at this beautiful, dangerous man offering her a devil's bargain wrapped in diamonds and promises. Every logical part of her brain screamed to refuse, to run, to protect what little she'd rebuilt of her life. But the part of her that had survived van der Merwe, that had rebuilt herself from broken pieces in a foreign country, that had learned to trust her instincts in the darkest moments. That part whispered a different answer. What if? Yes, she heard herself say, her voice stronger than she'd expected. Chaos erupted like a dam breaking. Cameras flashed with blinding intensity. Guests shouted questions over each other. Journalists pushed forward against security. Madame Shin's face cycled through white, red, and then carefully blank as years of social training reasserted control. Jae-won stood with fluid grace, slipped the ring onto Naledi's finger, it fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her hand, and pulled her close against his body. Trust me, he whispered against her ear, his breath warm on her skin. I'm going to make van der Merwe regret the day he first heard your name. Then he kissed her. Not for show. Not gently. Like a promise sealed in flesh. Like a threat delivered in intimacy. Like the beginning of a war that would end only one way. 48 hours later, Naledi woke in a penthouse she didn't recognize, wrapped in sheets that probably cost more than her used car, wearing an engagement ring that could buy a house in a nice suburb. For a disorienting moment, she thought it had all been a fever dream born of stress and exhaustion. Then Shin Jae-won walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, looking unfairly gorgeous in black silk pajama bottoms and nothing else. Morning light carved shadows across his chest, highlighting scars that told their own violent stories, bullet wounds, knife marks, the hieroglyphics of a life lived in danger. We match, Naledi said without thinking, the words slipping out before her filter could catch them. His lips quirked in something approaching a genuine smile. In more ways than one. He handed her coffee prepared exactly how she liked it. Somehow he'd already learned her preferences. How do you feel about a trip to Cape Town? She sat up, the sheets pooling around her waist. What? Van der Merwe made his move. Now we make ours. Jae-won sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. I have people who've been tracking him for the last 2 days. He's in South Africa, hiding in a compound outside Pretoria. He thinks he's won, that he's destroyed your credibility, embarrassed my family, secured his victory. Hasn't he? No. Jae-won's smile was razor-sharp and utterly devoid of mercy. He's given us the perfect excuse to go after him. A fiancé protecting his bride-to-be from her abuser? That's not revenge. That's romance. Despite everything, the insanity of the situation, the speed at which her life had transformed, Naledi laughed. It came out slightly unhinged, edged with hysteria. You're insane. Probably, he agreed easily. He reached out, tucked a lock behind her ear with surprising gentleness. But I'm also serious. You don't have to come. I can handle this without you. But I think you've earned the right to watch him fall. To see the man who tortured you brought to justice. To take back the power he stole. Something hot and sharp burned in Naledi's chest, a feeling she'd thought van der Merwe had killed. Hope. Rage. The hunger for justice. She'd spent 3 years running. 3 years looking over her shoulder. 3 years letting van der Merwe live rent-free in her nightmares, poisoning her sleep and her peace. When do we leave? 5 days later, Naledi stood on a hilltop outside Pretoria, looking down at a compound that haunted her dreams. High walls topped with razor wire. Armed guards making regular patrols. the stink of money built on the suffering of others. She held binoculars in steady hands while Jae-won stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Last chance to walk away, he offered quietly. Not a chance in hell. Taemin approached from behind, dressed in tactical gear that made him look like he'd been born for exactly this kind of operation. Teams are in position. Guards are neutralized, unconscious, not dead. We've got a 20-minute window before local authorities notice the security breach. Jae-won checked his weapon with practiced efficiency, a sleek pistol that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Remember, he said to his assembled team, his voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. Van der Merwe comes out alive. Damaged, but alive. He doesn't get the mercy of a bullet. He gets to face justice in The Hague. They moved like shadows given purpose, flowing down the hillside with military precision. Naledi had been given a tactical vest, a comm device, and strict instructions to stay in the armored vehicle with the backup team. She lasted exactly 10 minutes before following them into the compound. The interior was obscenely luxurious in the way of all-blood money, marble floors polished to mirrors, stolen art on the walls, beauty built on the backs of suffering. It made her stomach turn. She found Jae-won in the main office, standing over a man zip-tied to an expensive leather chair. Andre van der Merwe looked older than she remembered. Grayer. Smaller, somehow, without the power he'd wielded over her. But his eyes, those cold, colorless eyes that had watched her scream, were the same. They widened when he saw her, shock and something like fear flashing across his face. "Hello, Andre," Naledi said softly, savoring the way he flinched at her voice. How did you?" He looked at Jae-won, his brain trying to process the impossible. "Do you have any idea what she is? What she did for me? She's complicit in. I know you kidnapped a doctor and tortured her when she tried to maintain her medical ethics," Jae-won interrupted, his voice cold enough to frost glass. "I know you've been trafficking weapons to 3 different war zones. I know you're wanted in 14 countries and by Interpol." He smiled without warmth. "And I know that as of tomorrow morning, you're going to be in Interpol custody, facing trial for crimes against humanity." Van der Merwe's face twisted with rage and desperation. "You can't. I have connections, protection, people and governments." "You had connections," Taemin corrected, dropping a thick folder on the desk in front of him. "We've spent the last week systematically leaking your client list, your bank accounts, your safe houses, your dirty secrets to every intelligence agency and criminal organization you've ever crossed. Your protection is already turning on you. By morning, you'll have a dozen different groups trying to kill you. Interpol custody will be the safest place on earth for you." Naledi stepped forward, her shadow falling across Van der Merwe's face. He flinched like she'd struck him. "I spent 14 months afraid of you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "You made me watch people die. You burned me when I cried. You told me I'd never be free, that you'd find me anywhere I ran, that I belonged to you." She leaned down, bringing herself eye level with the monster who'd haunted her dreams. "You were wrong about everything." She straightened, turned to Jae-won with her head high. "I'm done here. Let's go." They left Andre van der Merwe screaming threats that evaporated like smoke in wind, empty, powerless, meaningless. 6 months later, spring had come to Seoul. The wedding wasn't supposed to be real. That's what they'd told themselves, what they'd agreed upon in the practical conversations about protection and strategy and mutual benefit. It was business. A transaction. A marriage of convenience that served both their purposes. But standing in a private garden in Bukshin-Hanok village, with cherry blossoms falling like pink snow and Naledi walking toward him in a gown that merged their 2 worlds, white silk and printed shweshwe fabric, a geography jacket over a fitted bodice that honored both Korea and South Africa. Jae-won realized he'd been lying to himself for months. She'd moved into his penthouse the week after the gala. They'd spent half a year navigating the complicated intersection of his world and hers, her hospital shifts that started before dawn and his midnight meetings that ended when most people were waking. Her trauma surgeries that saved gang members and civilians alike, and his empire building that operated in shadows and moral gray zones. They'd learned each other's scars, literal and metaphorical. The burns on her back and the bullet wounds on his chest. The nightmares that woke them both at 3 a.m. The triggers and the comforts and the slowly built trust. She made him laugh at things he'd thought had lost their humor. He made her feel safe in a way she hadn't since before Van der Merwe. It had stopped being strategy somewhere around month 2, though neither had acknowledged it aloud. Now, as she took his hands, as the officiant spoke in Korean and Kosa, as their families watched, his mother had come around eventually, won over by Naledi's steel spine and surgical precision and the way she didn't take any of Jae-won's shit. Jae-won knew this was the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. Not the gang wars. Not the deals with devils. Not the violence and the blood and the moral compromises. But this, opening his carefully guarded heart to someone who could actually break it. "I wasn't supposed to love you," he murmured in Korean as they exchanged rings, knowing she'd learned enough to understand. Naledi smiled, bright and genuine and devastating, and answered in Kosa. Taemin, standing as best man, translated for the assembled guests. "I wasn't supposed to survive. We're both full of surprises." When they kissed, it felt like coming home to a place neither had known they'd been searching for. 1 year after that, Dr. Naledi Kumalo-shin stood in front of a modern building in Soweto, Johannesburg, preparing to cut the ribbon on the Kumalo-shin Medical Center. The state-of-the-art trauma facility had been funded by the Hanseong Foundation and her husband's diversified business interests, some more legitimate than others. It served victims of violence, trafficking, and war. It asked no questions about who patients were or where they came from. It turned no one away, regardless of ability to pay. Jae-won stood beside her at the ribbon cutting, impossibly handsome in a charcoal suit, his hand resting protectively on the small but noticeable swell of her belly. At 5 months pregnant, she was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the so-called pregnancy glow and everything to do with contentment. "Your mother is going to spoil this baby absolutely rotten," Naledi murmured as cameras flashed. "Our child. Half Korean, half South African, 100% terrifying." He grinned with genuine delight. "I genuinely can't wait to meet them." A reporter shouted a question from the press section. "Mrs. Shin. Is it true your husband was part of organized crime?" Naledi looked at Jae-won. He raised an eyebrow. "Your call," his expression said clearly. She turned to face the cameras with the poise of someone who'd survived worse than intrusive questions. "My husband is a businessman who understands that the world isn't black and white. He's a man who's made mistakes and owns them. Who fights for the people he loves without hesitation or apology. Who helped me take down the man who tortured me and now funds medical centers across 3 countries serving the most vulnerable populations." She smiled, sharp and bright and utterly unrepentant. "Judge that however you want. I know who he is when the doors close and the cameras stop rolling. That's enough for me." The cameras flashed with renewed intensity, but Naledi had already turned away, her hand finding Jae-won's. That night, in their hotel suite overlooking Johannesburg's glittering skyline, Jae-won pulled her close against him, his hands splayed protectively over their growing child. "You know they'll always question us. Always wonder if you married me for protection, if I married you for reputation or strategy or some complicated power play. Let them wonder." Naledi kissed him, soft and slow and deep. "We know the truth. That's all that matters." "What's that?" "That my dress ripped at a gala I shouldn't have attended. You saw my scars, the visible proof of trauma I'd tried so hard to hide. And instead of looking away like everyone else." She touched his face, tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "You recognize them. Because you have your own." He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm with reverence. "Best decision I ever made. Kneeling for you in front of all those people." "Second best," she corrected with a smile. "The first was letting me save your life 6 months before that." "No," Jae-won said with absolute seriousness. "That was you saving me from bleeding out." "The kneeling? That was me saving myself from a life without you in it." Outside their window, Johannesburg glittered with a million lights, each one representing a story, a struggle, a survival. Inside, two survivors held each other close, their scars pressed together like puzzle pieces that had finally, impossibly, found their perfect match. And for the first time in both their complicated, violent, beautiful lives, they were home. And that's how a torn dress, a ruthless billionaire, and a surgeon with a past became the love story Seoul and Johannesburg couldn't stop talking about. If this story gave you all the feels, smash that like button, subscribe for more dark romance, and drop a comment telling us, Team Naledi or Team Jae-won? Or are you team, I need a man who'll burn the world down for me? And don't forget to check out our playlist for more stories of strong women and the dangerous men who fall at their feet. Until next time, stay obsessed, lovers.